Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Lipkin, Head Librarian of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. And I am pleased to welcome you to the presentation, Elizabeth Corwin, her book, Uncovering Women's Accounts from 17th Century Salem with Caylin Carbonell. We're very glad that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. And please note that closed captioning of this program is available via the CC button in your Zoom toolbar. This work of contemporary jewelry was created by the Aquino Wampanoag artist, Jonathan Perry. We are honored to have it on view in our current exhibition, Salem Stories, which is organized around the architecture of the alphabet to present 26 vignettes about the people, places, and events that make Salem, Massachusetts, the city it is today. Jonathan's work is a component of the letter A for Always Indigenous. And by starting here, the show begins long before the beginning of Salem and acknowledges that this land which we now inhabit was first indigenous and always will be. So I'd like to begin the program by respectfully acknowledging that the Peabody Essex Museum and the Phillips Library are on the ancestral territory of the Agawam, Pawtucket, Pennacook, Nomkeag, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag. Many other indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and indigenous people from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in honoring their communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. Thank you. Our speaker today, Caylin Carbonell, is the 2020 Francis E. Malami Research Fellow at the Phillips Library. I'd like to take this opportunity to offer our very special thanks to Michael Malami and his children, Jocelyn and Adam, who funded this fellowship in 2007 as a lasting tribute to Frances. She had deep roots within the library. A longstanding member of the museum family, she dedicated tireless hours processing manuscripts in our collection. She was an extraordinary individual who believed that the Phillips Library provides value to the academic community and the public, and realized the importance of the collection and its potential impact on the greater intellectual world. I should also mention that we are accepting applications for the 2021 Malami Fellowship, and the deadline is November 1st, so you still have time to apply. Details can be found on the Library Fellowship page of our website, pem.org. Many thanks are due to my PEM colleagues for pulling this together and helping make it happen, especially Jennifer Hornsby, Bethany Beatrice Gravel, and Mark Wood. Big thanks to our creative services, guest experience, and marketing teams too. And of course, to Caylin for sharing her research and her knowledge with us. Bit of housekeeping. Everyone is currently muted and cameras are off, but we do encourage questions. Please feel free to submit them via the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can in the final portion of the program. A recording of tonight's presentation will be posted at a later date, and we'll share that link with you when it's live. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Hornsby, Phillips Library's Reference and Access Services Librarian, to the screen. Well, you're on the screen, to introduce Caylin and start the program. I'm really grateful for Jen's hard work managing our fellowship programs and for her outstanding supervision and guidance of all of our reference services. So Jen, please take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to welcome you here today for our virtual program. Caylin Carbonell, as Dan mentioned, is the Phillips Library 2020 Francis E. Malami Research Fellow. She received her PhD from William and Mary in June 2020, where she completed a dissertation titled Fraught Labor, Fragile Authority, Households in Motion in Early New England. Prior to her doctoral work, Caylin received her master's from William and Mary in 2015 and her bachelor's from Bates in 2012. She has received generous support for her project from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the American Antiquarian Society, the Winterthur Museum and Library, and the New England Regional Consortium Fellowship Consortium, as well as several grants from William and Mary. She's previously presented work at conferences for the Alejandro Institute for Early American History and Culture, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, the American Society for 18th Century Studies, and the Southern Association for Women's Historians. Caylin is currently the Hench Post-Dissertation Fellow at the American Antiquarian Society, where she's working on expanding her research and reformulating her dissertation for publication. So welcome, Caylin. Please take it away.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen really quickly. Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer and Dan, for the great introductions. Good afternoon. I am delighted by this opportunity to share some of my research with you today. So I want to start by thanking the entire staff of the Peabody Essex Museum and Phillips Library for helping me to coordinate this exciting event, and for all of their help while I was at the library this summer. I also want to, again, thank the Malami family for funding this generous fellowship, which has been really critical to my ongoing research. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to my project, but then I want to talk today, as advertised, more about Elizabeth Gibbs Corwin, some of the reasons that I came to the Phillips Library in the first place, and also some of what I learned. So on the broadest level, I am a historian of early America, but more specifically, I'm interested in women's history and the history of marginalized peoples in colonial America. My dissertation, which was titled Fraught Labor and Fragile Authority, Households in Motion in Early New England, considered the ways in which various members of households, from wives to children to enslaved and hired laborers, were active in shaping the colonial economy through both their collaboration with and their resistance to household strategies. One of the driving methodological arguments of that work was that it's only on this local, really granular level at which we find evidence of the ways in which all of these individuals who were fashioned as dependents were actually key actors. That is to say, as a historian, I deal with the local and sometimes really the extra local. I'm keenly interested in the details of everyday life and the ways in which this level of detail reveals a much wider cast of actors as compared with the white property men that we are used to reading about in history books. So the more particular focus of my talk today is women's accounts. This is a topic that I became particularly interested in about a year ago while I was a short-term fellow at the American Antiquarian Society. So during my time at the AAS, I worked with a couple of books that were marked in the catalog as men's account books, but the content within suggested otherwise. I wasn't entirely surprised, however. Scholars have for decades suggested that women were more economically active than records necessarily reveal. Scholars have shown, for example, that court records offer glimpses of women's economic activities. As Dalit Hemphill summarized in her work with the Essex County court records, quote, "Again and again, the court records show men and women working, socializing, misbehaving, or making family decisions together. Even so, these are mostly just glimpses. As Laurel Thatcher Ulrich remarked in 1982 in her groundbreaking book, Good Wives, there were thought to be no surviving account books that had been kept by a woman before 1750 in colonial America. Ulrich suggested that women perhaps were more likely to keep their accounts orally or to mark them in ephemeral ways, such as with chalk on a wall. So in the years, I went too far. In the years since that publication, however, several accounts by women have resurfaced. For New England, these include some scattered accounts in the late 17th and early 18th century diary of Mehetabel Chandler Coit, in Mary Starbuck's account book in Nantucket during a similar period. There are accounts by the widowed Elizabeth Shrimpton Stoddard while in Boston from the 1720s through the 1750s. And you can see my image of one of those books on the left side of the screen. There is a receipt book owned by Rebecca Amory in Boston during her widowhood in the 1730s, and that's shown on the right side of the screen. And an account book by Elizabeth Newbury during her widowhood in Connecticut in the 1740s. Still, these are few and far between, and the majority were kept by widowed women, which still leaves questions then about married women's role in account keeping. Of course, for the later 18th century and the early 19th century, women's account books were much more common, as reflected in the rich scholarship on that period, and remembered best perhaps for the diary and accounts kept by Martha Ballard. So while I was at the AAS, I became very interested in a book in the Robert Gibbs Business Records collection. This was a volume kept between the late 1660s and the early 1710s. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call that volume the Gibbs General Store book, as it was believed to hold accounts from the Gibbs General Store. And I actually looked at this book in the first place, suspecting that it might contain female authored accounts, as a generous archivist had noted in the catalog entry that Robert Gibbs had died in 1674 and, quote, his business continued after his death, possibly managed by his wife Elizabeth and/or his son Robert. This is also something that other historians have suggested as a possibility, and from my discussions with colleagues and archivists, it seemed to be fairly likely that this book had some writing in it from Robert's wife, Elizabeth. So I was enamored by this little book, which contained hundreds of accounts scribbled all over the place and seemingly not in chronological order, with some pages jumping from the 1670s to the 1690s from top to bottom. And you can even see that here, I think. This is an account from 1673 and this one from 92. What I now know is that when the pages ran out, the account keepers went back to previous pages to fill in any blank spaces, which left behind a patchwork of accounts over time. The book is filled with accounts for purchases as bizarre as a turtle in a basket, which you can see in the bottom left image, but also as mundane as butter and eggs, which were perhaps the most common currency throughout its pages. And you can see some of those accounts on the right-hand page, on the right-hand image. So I knew that this book would be a great boon for a project like mine, but this would require that I make some sense of it, beginning with the several different types of handwriting within. So as you'll see here, there were at least 3 different hands in the book. So one in blue, one in red, and a third in green. So I knew that Robert died in 1674, and that was one clue to this handwriting mystery. But I still needed to sort out these 3 distinct hands and to make sense of when things were written, especially since many of the accounts were actually undated. I had my suspicions. I thought hand 1 might be Robert's, and I also thought that hand 2 might be Elizabeth's, but I felt that I needed more evidence to confirm this, and especially to make sense of the 3rd hand that appears in the book much less frequently. Thankfully, there was one more piece of evidence at the AAS that helped me to begin to piece together this story. So as you can see here, someone had kindly affixed a note to this account book indicating that after Robert Gibbs dies in 1674, his widow Elizabeth Gibbs had remarried to Jonathan Corwin. For those of you in Salem or with some knowledge of the Salem witch trials, the name may ring a bell, as Jonathan Corwin was a judge during the Salem witch trials, and his house, which is pictured on the right, is still extant and open to visitors, known today as the Witch House. What was more exciting to me, however, was that the Peabody Essex's Phillips Library had a collection called the Corwin Family Papers, and despite the change in spelling, the finding aids showed that many of these papers concerned Jonathan Corwin's family. If I had not needed to finish my dissertation, I probably would have driven to the archives right there and then, but I diligently applied for a fellowship and I waited until July of 2020 when I got the clear that the library would be reopening with new safety precautions in light of COVID. And so this brings me to my time this summer at the Phillips Library. And you can see this was my tweet on my first day there. I was very excited to be back in the archives. At the Phillips Library, I was hoping to find more about Jonathan Corwin, but even more importantly about his wife, Elizabeth Gibbs Corwin, who I suspected may have been one of the primary authors of the General Store account book at the AAS. At the Phillips Library, I was greeted by a trove of materials, really any researcher's dream. So the Corwin family papers is a huge collection. It literally measures 10 linear feet. And if I were to tell you everything I learned there about the Corwin family, and don't get me wrong, I would love to, I'd love nothing more, but we'd be here for days. So in the interest of time, I'm going to touch on 3 different topics. So first, Elizabeth's earlier life and her marriage to Robert Gibbs. Second, her time as a widow. And then third, her relationship with Jonathan Corwin. So the materials at the Phillips Library were incredibly useful in filling out details in all 3 of these areas. Even though the story came to me in pieces, slowly over the last few months, and in a process that's really still very much ongoing, I'm going to share Elizabeth's story in chronological order, as I think that will be the easiest way to convey the rich details that I uncovered at the Phillips Library. So to begin with some biographical data, Elizabeth was born in 1644 to Jacob and Margaret Sheaf. And please, these are my very partial family trees that I made just to kind of give you a sense of the main players. So Elizabeth's born to Jacob and Margaret Sheaf. I don't know much of her childhood, except that she was an only child until the age of 14, when her sister Marital was born. Both of Elizabeth's parents were born fairly well off. Her father had a successful mercantile career in Boston, and we can imagine she was fairly well provided for in her youth. In 1659, only a year after her sister was born, Elizabeth's father died, leaving her mother widowed with an infant daughter. A year later, Elizabeth's grandfather, her mother's father, Henry Webb, also a quite wealthy merchant, he died that year, which added to the family's burden. And since there were no male heirs, Margaret Webb Sheaf and her daughters, Elizabeth and Marital, came into large inheritances. Elizabeth had married only months before her grandfather's death in 1660, and so her inheritance would benefit not only her, but her new husband, Robert Gibbs. Robert Gibbs was also born into wealth and status. The 4th son of Sir Henry Gibbs in Warwickshire, England, Robert emigrated to Boston in 1638 to make his way as a merchant. He was well connected from the offset, and his family connections included a brother in Barbados, which enabled his success. But whatever success Robert had as a merchant in the 2 years prior to marrying Elizabeth was eclipsed, however, by the assets that he gained through her inheritance. Notably, the couple inherited property in Boston at Fort Hill, where they would build an expensive estate, probably expansive as well as a warehouse and a wharf in Boston and part of a sawmill in Maine. And you can see here 2 images that show Fort Hill. The one on the left is courtesy of the MHS, and was drawn by Samuel Clough and depicts Boston in 1676. And the image on the right is the more famous John Bonner map from the 1720s. So if it isn't clear already, Elizabeth and Robert were quite wealthy. They belonged to a group of elite merchant families in Boston. The mansion they built at Fort Hill was described by John Josselyn as a, quote, stately edifice, and it was thought to have cost nearly £3,000. Along with fellow merchant John Freak, with whom Robert did business, the Gibbs commissioned portraits of their 3 children in 1670. 2 of these hang in the MFA in Boston, while the third is owned by the Clay Center in West Virginia. And so from left to right, the 3 portraits depict the couple's 3 children, Margaret, Robert, and Henry. Luckily, thanks to a few folders of Robert's business records at the AAS, as well as the work of previous scholars, especially Margaret Newell and James McWilliams, who both have worked with the Gibbs book and the records at the AAS, and whose respective books are shown here on this slide, I came to the Phillips Library with a basic understanding of how Robert Gibbs's business operated. So at the simplest level, Robert was an import and an export merchant. He invested in various ships, and he arranged to send fish, timber, and other provisions to Spain and the Caribbean, In turn, he imported cloth goods, rum, sugar, molasses, wine, tobacco, and also enslaved people. And he sold many of these goods locally. Robert owned a general store, which allowed him to, in Margaret Newell's words, act as both wholesaler and retailer. And since Elizabeth had inherited part of a sawmill in Maine from her grandfather, the Gibbs had even more opportunities to control not only consumption, but also production, providing them with timber to send abroad. Although you might not notice it if you were not looking specifically for it, Robert Gibbs actually creeps into the Corwin family papers several times. Perhaps most importantly, one of his account books survives in the Corwin collections, where it has been labeled as Jonathan Corwin's, since Jonathan did write in the book at a later date. I noticed that the handwriting in the beginning of the book didn't quite match that in the latter part, but this didn't actually ring any alarm bells at first, since merchants often had apprentices and others writing in their books. So it wasn't until I was very familiar with everyone's handwriting that I noticed that these accounts were not Jonathan's at all, but actually Robert's. Both the handwriting and the content within matched scattered accounts of Robert's at the AAS. And it suddenly all came together that this book had at first belonged to Robert Gibbs. So as you can see on this slide, I have here on the top a portion of a page from the volume on the previous slide. So this top portion is from the Phillips Library Corwin family papers. Below it, you'll see 3 images from the AAS records. So on the left is from his business folders, the right is from the general store account book, and the bottom is from another collection at the AAS, and that's his signature. And you can see these actually all match not only in handwriting, but 3 of these accounts are all with the same individual, John Jolliffe. So together with these collections in the AAS, this account book of Robert's is useful for understanding his mercantile career, especially because the book begins in 1658, prior to many of the records at the AAS, and thus offers an extended view of his tenure as a merchant. So to return to the questions that I posed at the beginning regarding handwriting in the Gibbs General Store account book, it should seem clear at this point that hand 1 was none other than Robert Gibbs. And although the records at the AAS were in some ways sufficient to prove this, it wasn't until I spent time working with the Corwin family papers that I was able to approach this book with a clear enough sense of the timeline and of the major players to confirm this. So with that out of the way, that brings me to my next question. Was hand 2 Elizabeth Corwin, or Elizabeth Gibbs Corwin? This was in some ways the thing that I wanted to prove most while researching at the Phillips Library. Despite the fact that several people had suggested that Elizabeth was writing in the book, I felt that I needed evidence of that. If she was in fact hand 2, it would mean that the majority of the accounts in the book were hers, which would be an exciting find. Thankfully, and I apologize for the spoiler, but there was a plethora of evidence at the Phillips Library pointing to exactly this. The most exciting of these was a tiny little book that was found in one of the folders in the Corwin family papers. I wasn't expecting it, and I could not believe my luck. In the advertisements for this talk and on the title page, you've already seen an image from this book. In the front cover, Elizabeth inscribed her name and the date 1682. Next to that, she began to copy a book called The Saints Legacies, or a collection of certain promises out of the Word of God collected. We do not know if perhaps a friend or a family member had lent the book to Elizabeth and she copied it over in manuscript form so that she might add a copy to her library, or perhaps she copied it as a devotional practice or even a scholastic practice. But for whatever reason, at the age of 38 years old, Elizabeth sat down and recorded the entirety of the Saints Legacies. At first, I was simply in awe of Elizabeth's task of copying. Given I've spent the last few weeks writing postcards to encourage people to vote in the upcoming election, I cannot imagine the patience and time it took to record this entire book by hand. My rough estimate is that there are about 185 pages of copied text, and she includes an index at the end, which she also copied. I hope these images give a sense of really the size of this undertaking. Elizabeth's act of copying was impressive enough, of course, but Curiosity led me to research a bit more about the Saints Legacies, and I was struck by my findings. Although the book was first published anonymously, it was later published with the author listed as AF, who David Como has concluded was Anne Fenwick. Como describes Anne Fenwick as a, quote, prophetess and scriptural exegete, a, quote, fairly radical nonconformist Puritan in early 17th century England. Although it's impossible to know whether Elizabeth could have known that the text she was copying was itself written by a woman, the possibility is certainly quite enticing. What struck me more, however, was that at the back of this same book, Elizabeth penned a few pages that I would argue comprise a financial biography of sorts. Probably written after 1693 when her mother died, since she includes mention here of her mother's estate inventory, the financial biography is fairly short. It's only 5 pages in total, but in it, Elizabeth allows a glimpse of her identity as an economic actor. I had gone into the archive hoping for perhaps a glimpse of Elizabeth's handwriting, and here I was with her bold assertions of her economic prowess. She wrote of her time as a widow, of the debts that she had recovered, and then of the debts that her second husband, Jonathan, had recovered on her behalf. In particular, I was intrigued by her claim about gathering in debts as a widow that she, and you can see this on the left hand page, quote, should have gathered in many more had I so continued. The claim was foreshadowing to the other pages of the text. I needed to drink some water. To the other pages of the text wherein she outlined all of the debts that Jonathan had recovered on her behalf, despite noting that many of these were, quote, due to me. This reflected the English legal system and the law of coverture, which meant that when Elizabeth married, she was legally covered by her husband, and her assets became his. Although Elizabeth does not explicitly state whether she found fault with this particularity of English property law, the biography does in some ways suggest that Elizabeth knew very well what was hers, and she took ink to paper to record this for posterity. So without a doubt, this book answered my question about Elizabeth Gibbs Corwin writing in the General Store account book. This was a clear demonstration of her writing experience and her financial acumen, plus it gave me nearly 200 pages of her handwriting to compare with the Gibbs book. And you can see here a comparison of the 2 books with the General Store book on the left and a page from the Saints Legacies little book on the right. This still left me with questions, however. What was Elizabeth's role in her marital economy? How did she work together with both of her husbands? And whose was the third hand in the Gibbs Store book? Sorry, in the General Store book. And I went too far. Okay. To make sense of Elizabeth's economic collaboration requires that we consider Elizabeth's marriage to Jonathan, his business, and their marital economy. When Elizabeth married Jonathan in March of 1676, the marriage was in many ways a strategic one, as Jonathan was in the same business as Robert. In fact, oftentimes historians compare the 2 men alongside one another as examples of developments in the later 17th century mercantile economy. And yet very few recognize that both men married Elizabeth, and nobody ever considers how Elizabeth might have shaped her 2 husbands' economies. Jonathan's father, George Corwin, was one of the most successful merchants in Salem in the earlier period, and Jonathan worked under his father for years, his own hand balancing accounts in his father's name earlier in his career. Jonathan later struck out on his own, and like Gibbs, he exported fish, timber, and farm products in exchange for imported goods, which he sold out of a shop in Salem. His marriage to Elizabeth was in many ways strategic, as many early American marriages were. In particular, Elizabeth's property inheritance, the partial ownership of a sawmill in Maine, the wharfs and the properties in Boston, the shop goods that continued to come in on ships after Robert's death. These all helped to support and even to expand and diversify Jonathan's holdings. Furthermore, Jonathan gained in Elizabeth a wife that was knowledgeable of this industry, who had previously helped to run a shop and keep accounts, as I hope to demonstrate by the end of this talk. So the Corwin family papers are filled with evidence of Jonathan's handwriting, of his business affairs, and of the ways in which his marriage to Elizabeth shaped his business prospects. A letter from Elizabeth's stepfather, Thomas Thatcher, which is shown on the left, in which Thomas asked Jonathan to pay another New Englander on his behalf, reflects the ways in which a marriage to Elizabeth would have widened Jonathan's network. Additionally, a lot of these papers concerned business that was tied to Elizabeth's inheritance. He regularly corresponded, for example, with Joseph Storer, who worked at the sawmill in Maine, especially as the mill experienced a number of disruptions in the 1670s and 80s. And so on the right, you see a letter to Joseph Storer from Jonathan. As Elizabeth had indicated in her financial biography, Jonathan also managed debts on Robert Gibbs's estate. Together, these papers not only paint a picture of Jonathan's business interests, but they also reflect just how much his own activities were shaped by the assets that Elizabeth brought to the marriage. Additionally, these papers give us a sense of Jonathan's handwriting, and it quickly became clear that the third hand, the one that entered the book in 1676, at the same moment that Elizabeth and Jonathan married, was undoubtedly Jonathan's own hand. The handwriting mysteries with which I began were finally solved by the Corwin family papers. It was clear that Robert and Elizabeth had written in the general store account book from the late 1660s when they began the book through 1674 when Robert died. At that point, Elizabeth continued writing, and when she remarried Jonathan, he too began to write in the book once in a while, but his hand only appeared very occasionally and mostly in the early years of their marriage. After the first few years, he left Elizabeth to manage the book mostly on her own, but even with a very clear idea of what each of these three hands looks like, I still wanted to know more about Elizabeth and Jonathan's marital economy. So to explore these ideas, two types of sources at the Phillips Library were extremely useful. First, correspondence, and second, more account books, both of which were quite revealing of Elizabeth's role in the family's business affairs. Okay, so I went too far. Okay. There are a series of letters in the collection written mostly in the 1690s and the early 1700s from Robert Gibbs Jr., so Elizabeth's son by her first marriage, to his mother and stepfather, Jonathan Corwin. And the majority of these letters concern goods purchased by Robert Gibbs Jr. in Boston and sent to his parents in Salem. Although I do not know much about Robert Jr.'s own circumstances yet, he did seem to have connections across the merchant community in Boston from whom he could purchase goods and to help supply his parents for their shop, a process in which they were both actively invested. This might have reflected a shift in their business as perhaps Jonathan Corwin was winding down his own involvement in imports in these years, or Robert may have simply acted to supplement his parents' overall stock. Either way, Robert sent a letter to Elizabeth, which we see on the left-hand side, in which he described his difficulty locating the goods that she had requested, especially whalebone, which he described as, quote, very dear and scarce. He worried that the goods might not, quote, answer your expectations. Likewise, in July of 1699, this time in a letter to his father, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, Robert wrote, quote, I have done what I can to procure the things that my mother writes for. Unfortunately, he had fallen short, noting, quote, the scythes of that sort were all gone but 1 dozen. At the bottom of the note, he added more details describing the scythes that he had sent, but noting that he could get, quote, the best largest for 40 shillings apiece if you see cause. These letters were clear indicators of Elizabeth's particular tastes, as well as her role in soliciting specific consumer goods for their shop. As these examples demonstrate, part of Elizabeth's job involved knowing her customer base and the specific items that they would like to purchase, as well as contacting family members and other contacts in Boston to locate or import these goods. In addition, again, too far? Okay. In addition to these letters, one of the most interesting parts of the Corwin family papers is the large number of account books, which offer an opportunity to really dive into the Corwins' economic ventures. Scholars like Daniel Vickers and James McWilliams have really done a lot with these ledgers, and especially because I'm not trained in the methods of economic history, it was largely because of the work that they have done before me that I was able to make sense of these books. Although Jonathan's handwriting is in many of the books in the collection, and there's many more than those that are pictured on the screen, The only 4 that I could definitively say were his accounts, as they appear on the screen, are volumes 10, 9, 11, and the second half of volume 8, which I've already shown you at first belonged to Robert Gibbs. Of these 4 books, the one on the far left was a ledger, and then the other 3 were used as waste or day books. To get a sense of the difference, here is an image of the ledger. And you can see here that the account keeper, in this case, Jonathan Corwin, listed the names of each customer, and then he calculated their debits and credits over time. However, prior to writing in a ledger like this one, most account keepers would keep track of running accounts in a waste or a day book, as you can see here. These allowed them to list chronologically their transactions on a day-to-day basis, and they were particularly important for shopkeepers and for merchants that were frequently receiving or dispersing goods. 3 of Jonathan's wastes survive, one running from the time of his marriage through 1687, another from 1687 through 1691, and when that one filled up, Jonathan must have run out of books because he opened the book that had once belonged to Elizabeth's first husband, and he began in the back of that book his waste in 1691, and continued actually up until his and Elizabeth's deaths. Together, these 3 books provide a consistent account of Jonathan's sales from 1676 through his death in 1718. So what I noticed when I looked at these accounts more closely, however, was that I recognized Elizabeth's hand in the 2 later waste books. For whatever reason, Elizabeth did not write in Jonathan's first book, but in 1687, when he opened a new one, Elizabeth began writing in it as well. Although Jonathan wrote in the book more frequently than Elizabeth did, she regularly picked it up, some months more than others, and she recorded the purchases that customers made and the goods that they had received in return. For example, in December of 1691, which you can see here, and on the bottom, she sent to the wife of John Waters some striped stuff, some blue linen, Algiers, thread, cambrics, sugar, and a broom. She received from John Kemble a hog, a bushel of turnips, and to Nathaniel Putnam's son, she gave a bushel of salt. Jonathan's hand is also visible on these accounts, and you can see here he indicated that the purchases from John Waters went to John Waters' wife, and here he added in a line about additional credits by John Kemble. And this is something that I actually see in the general store account book as well, where they're acting almost in an editorial way, where they go back and forth and edit each other's accounts. So I'm still in the process of analyzing these joint accounts, but I believe that they may be interesting even to those looking to learn more about the Salem witch trials and about Jonathan's role as a judge. So if you take, for example, his waste book, during the months that he was responsible for examining locals accused of witchcraft, during that time, Jonathan did perhaps more business than usual with his brother-in-law, John Hathorne, likely because John was also one of the judges. And this is reflected, for example, in one of the notes where he described giving Hathorne money, but he indicated that it was, quote, delivered himself when we came from Ipswich Court. And I think you can see that on the bottom there. Beyond this, it is perhaps worth considering that Elizabeth seems to have written in the book more than usual during these months, signifying perhaps that she might have been keeping shop while his attention was on the trials. A third potential line of inquiry concerns the role of cloth in the proceedings, since Jonathan Corwin was a frequent purveyor of cloth goods in the town. His sales of Paragon, for example, might take us back to Bridget Bishop's red Paragon bodice. And it is worth considering that he did business with several individuals that were involved in the trials. Might this have changed his view of clothing mentioned in testimonies during the trials? As other historians have also noted, these were not strangers to Corwin. And in fact, some of the individuals embroiled in the witch trials were his longtime customers. These are all just suggestions, some of which I need to spend a lot more time unraveling, especially as I don't usually deal strictly with the witch trials themselves, and I know there's a large body of scholarship that I've only begun to broach. But this is all to say that when we take this extra local focus, when we look at Jonathan and Elizabeth's everyday finances, the way that they ran their shop together on a daily basis, there is so much more we can learn. I want to begin to conclude And I want to make 3 final but related points all about collaboration. But on this last slide, I've included a few images from some of the books within that I think show the level of collaboration in some of these account books. Of course, these pages are perhaps in some ways exaggerations. These were pages that were likely scribbled on by children, used for writing practice over the years. But I also think that they gesture at just the sheer amount of collaboration that went into accounting and the many hands that took turns writing down accounts. The first of my final points concerns Elizabeth's marital collaboration with her 2 husbands. As I've shown, a lot of my research at the Phillips Library was in pursuit of a better understanding of these relationships. Perhaps my most significant finding in the Corwin family papers was those waste books of Jonathan Corwin's, where I was able to identify Elizabeth's handwriting. What is equally significant, however, is those documents that don't contain any of Elizabeth's writing. I know these include, for example, Robert's ledger, Jonathan's ledger, as well as Jonathan's first waste book. Elizabeth might not have written in these ledgers, in part because of a gender division of labor in which she helped run the shop, but perhaps she did not help to balance the family's overall accounts. That being said, Elizabeth too owned a ledger of sorts. The little book at the American Antiquarian Society that really brought me here in the first place, the General Store Account Book, is an odd mix of account book types, but it really resembles a single entry ledger more than a waste, as Elizabeth listed accounts under the names of customers, and she compiled these over time. Although I don't have time today to go into Elizabeth's accounts in that book and the meaning of her separate ledger, I am working on an article that more fully delves into that practice. So I hope that you'll be able to read more about that in the future. My major takeaway here, however, is that we need to stop assuming that all records were kept by men just because their names are the ones papered across our archival records. We must take better heed of collaboration and ask questions about who these collaborators might have been, even when we do not always know their names or recognize their writing. This brings me to my second concluding point, this one about collaboration beyond that of simply husbands and wives. My larger book project is very much about how we might measure and account for economic collaboration, but I'm interested in collaboration far beyond that of wealthy elite white colonists like Jonathan and Elizabeth. While it was very exciting to spend some time thinking about Elizabeth, in part because she does leave behind such a large archival record, most of the people that I'm interested in studying are far more marginal than Elizabeth. Many did not know how to read or write, and many appear in records in only the slightest of glimpses, often anonymously. While Elizabeth's role in the Corwin family economy is certainly worth studying, her records invite questions about the other laboring women and men that carried out the essential work that allowed their economy to function. The benefit of records like these is that they are so extensive, and so they provide these opportunities to do that type of work as well. What I did not talk about today, and yet one of my major focuses going forward, is pulling these people out of these same records. So using the Corwin papers to think about Senko, a man whom the Corwins enslaved, or the many maids who worked for the Corwin family over the years and who appear in their accounts. These records hold so many possibilities, and uncovering Elizabeth's collaboration is merely a starting point, a first layer, if you will. My eventual goal is, in fact, to decenter voices like hers in order to bring more attention to these other, more diverse collaborators. So my third and my final point about collaboration is about collaboration of a different sort. I believe that the stories I have told today are as good an argument as any for the continued need for collaboration among scholars and among archives. There are papers relating to Elizabeth Gibbs Corwin and her 2 husbands in at least 3 collections at the American Antiquarian Society, at the Phillips Library, obviously, at the Clements Library, and possibly elsewhere. There are also paintings of the Gibbs children. There's silver passed down by Elizabeth on display at the MFA in Boston. The Corwin house still survives and is open to visitors in Salem. And if I hadn't started with the records at the Antiquarian Society, I probably would have missed Elizabeth's handwriting in Jonathan's waste books. Just as if I had not worked with these Corwin family papers, I would still have so many unanswered questions about the account books at the AAS. That is all, I hope, a reminder of the importance of cross-archival collaboration, of funding sources that allow researchers to visit multiple archives, and of the importance of collaboration among scholars and researchers who are looking at many of the same collections. It's only with this type of collaboration that we can get to know our sources on a deeper level, one that will allow the types of research that I hope will make it easier to learn more about the laboring people in Elizabeth and Jonathan's household, who are really only a brief footnote to this presentation. So thank you for your attention this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. We are just going to pose a reminder to everyone. If you are interested in asking questions, you can submit it via the Q&A function or in the chat. And we will get to as many as possible. So thank you. I want to personally thank you for talking about the collaboration that needs to happen between institutions and scholars at the end of your talk there, and say that we often, as librarians, rely on scholars who use our papers to point out additional keywords, access points, people. So one of the things that's exciting to us is we can now add Robert Gibbs's name to the Corwin family paper records as an access point, and hopefully people will come and use it for that reason. So thank you so much. And that's a reminder to all of our users that we always appreciate dialogue between the librarians and our researchers. So a couple of questions that have come in. Is there any evidence of enslaved persons that you have seen in the shop records? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes, and this is something that I'm actually very much interested in and doing more work on. So Elizabeth and her first husband owned an enslaved man, as I briefly mentioned, whose name I believe is Senko, although the name actually changes. Like there's later records in the Essex County Court records, there's records that suggest that his name was Zenki. And I do believe they're the same person just based on records. But essentially after Robert dies, Elizabeth, she essentially rents him out, which is a very common practice in the colonial period, to a shopkeeper in Boston, John Wing. And that's actually the reason there are records in the Essex County Court records, because John Wing demands of Elizabeth and Jonathan Corwin financial remuneration for basically getting this man treated for smallpox. And so there's that, but then also there are mentions in Jonathan Corwin's account books of and in letters between Elizabeth and Jonathan of Senko kind of either being rented out to perform labor for other people in Salem, of him performing tasks that are, helpful to their own communication. So when Elizabeth's in Boston, she actually says, if you could send Senko to check if if such and such captain will be there, then I can make this exchange possible. And then beyond that, enslaved people actually appear somewhat frequently. I think more frequently than recognized in account books of this sort, mostly in these small notations that I think are very much reflective of kind of how they were viewed, right? And what I'm referring to when I say they're marginal, in that they're these small notations that say either DD or per, a tiny symbol, and then they say Negro. And that's essentially saying I gave those goods to your Negro, to your enslaved man. And that's just the language that they use that I'm quoting. And so that's actually one of my major goals in my manuscript, which is to think about the ways in which enslaved people are facilitating this economy, are coming into shops, and what that means that they're in these spaces. So I appreciate the question.
Cool. Are there any particular notes in these books that stood out to you?
That's a great question. Notes, I wonder of what sort the question is asking. I guess I was struck by the diversity of just of the accounts, and kind of how much, I guess what I learned from these accounts is that it's not as if, I guess we often separate female and male economies, right? And it's not as if Jonathan Corwin and Robert Gibbs are dealing with fish hooks and timber and Elizabeth is doing clothes and butter, right? I mean, to some extent, she is managing butter and eggs quite a bit, but she actually is responsible for a lot of the transactions that include fish hooks pretty regularly, pigs, what else? I guess that basically, I've been surprised by the extent to which this economy is so interdependent, and the ways in which they really relied on each other. And I think that that has been just so clear to me. And so that's really been one of the most fascinating parts of this research.
Cool. How many Corwin generations, families, were actively living in and around Salem before, during, and after the Salem Trials? I know you did a little genealogical research. If you can speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to provide a great answer. What I can say is that the Corwin family papers finding aid through PhilCat, through the Peabody Essex Museum, actually has a great resource for getting at this question, which, and I unfortunately took this slide out of my PowerPoint and now I wish it had been there, but there is a family tree that has been, I believe, created by the staff of the library. That actually, I believe it shows all of the branches of the Corwin family that are reflected in this set of records, which is actually quite a few generations. And so I, to be honest, would like to come back to the Phillips Library and do more research, especially as I've been figuring things out, because the Corwin family, there's many generations that I'm not talking about here, right? And that it continues, and their papers are quite voluminous, especially in the 18th century. So I will say that there's consistently Corwins from the earlier 17th century, definitely through the mid 18th century. But I can't give an accounting of how many members of the family there really were.
Of course, and your time was so focused on the work that you were trying to accomplish. Did you use Ancestry.com at all for this type of research, or? Yeah.
Yes, so it's interesting. So I'm not trained as a genealogist in any way, and if anyone who has any hints or leads for me, I would love please email me, because I actually think that this kind of work demonstrates the importance of, again, collaboration is this big watchword right now, but between genealogists and historians, because I relied a lot on Ancestry.com, on American ancestors through the New England Historic Genealogical Society. They were really helpful in locating things like Robert Gibbs's estate inventory. So one of the really fascinating things I found was in his estate inventory, they go through, and so you really get a sense of the house, this like extravagant mansion that the Gibbs are living in at Fort Hill. And the thing that struck me most was that they describe maps in like every room, and like multiple maps. And so I'm imagining this house in which maps are just kind of a huge part of her visual landscape. But there was that, there was the will of Henry Webb, which was really essential. And then just sorting out who some of these people are. You'll notice a lot of the people have the same name. And so that's, a struggle, is which Corwin is this really? And is it John or Jonathan, right? Because he has a brother named John. And so sorting those things out really, I think, reveals the importance of genealogy and genealogical methods.
So you talked a little bit about Elizabeth recovering debts on her own, and then Jonathan kind of stepped in to help her. Was she, how long was she a widow, like in between her marriages, and are there surviving records from that period? And was she able to sustain herself off of her inheritance and whatnot?
Yeah, so, okay, so the records are spotty, but I believe that Robert Gibbs dies in December of 1674. So she's actually only a widow for about 15 months because she marries Jonathan in March of 1676. And so she's a widow for this brief period of time. And there's a record in the American Antiquarian Society, has a few folders from Robert Gibbs. One of those is a letter where I'm forgetting what the exact legal terms are, but it's essentially a letter in which she takes, she is officially made the administrator of his estate. And so as the administrator, and scholars like Sarah Damiano have done a lot of work on female administrators, she would have taken on a lot of responsibility financially and economically to recover those debts. I do know that during that time, she very much continues almost as if nothing happened. That's one of the peculiar parts of the general store account book, which is at the AAS, is that you wouldn't know. The reason I say it's so difficult to figure out when Robert Gibbs dies is you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know it from her accounts. There's no mention of it, and they continue on with the same clients. And so she's very much doing business through that year before she remarries.
Via the shop or?
Via, I believe, the shop in Boston. And so that's one of the questions that I have is, so she's definitely, there are descriptions of her going into the warehouse in Boston. And there are many transactions that suggest she's still working out of the shop. I don't actually know where the shop is, and that's one of my big questions, and something I would love to know is they describe in his estate inventory, they describe some of what's in the shop, but they say a shop in Boston. And so I don't know if it's actually at Fort Hill or elsewhere. But my presumption is that they're working with the shop. Unfortunately, these records are, in terms of how much they actually mention these physical spaces, are so ambiguous. And so even as with the Corwins, there's this amazing record of Jonathan's father, George's shop, and of his, the inventory of that shop. And so we do have a sense of like what one of their shops might have looked like. But the fact that they owned and worked in a shop and that's what these waste books represent is to some extent a supposition. I mean, they don't write about going into the shop, which is unfortunate.
Excellent, thank you. So another question is, even though Elizabeth kept business records, would a personal diary be usual for a woman to keep, at least a woman who was involved in business?
That's a great question. So I'm going to say I don't really know. And the reason I say that is because, unfortunately, so few of these survive. And it doesn't mean that they did not exist, as I'll say, but they don't survive. And I think that's often, they're small, they're often considered, I think, not important, right? If we're thinking about who is archiving and who is deciding what stays and what gets preserved, it's often, not the small books kept by women, unfortunately. And that's something that I think scholars have been pushing against for years. And so I know, I think a good example of this, and something that a book that would be helpful in thinking about a question like this is Mahedable Chandler Coit. And so there's a book written by Michelle Marchetti Coughlin called One Colonial Woman's World that's about that diary. And I believe it is the only known pre-1700s diary for a woman as well. And so in terms of how common it is, the archival record would suggest no, but I'm not sure that that's true. And so I would say maybe it was more common. We don't know. Hopefully, maybe we'll find out more, and more of these will kind of resurface over the next few years.
And just as an aside to that, with my experience of the diaries that we have in the Phillips Library, in general, diaries were more a notation of your daily activities back then, rather than, your feelings and experiences and stuff like that. So two more questions. The question is, did you encounter a difference in the content, or for an example, the level of detail between Elizabeth or either of her husband's accounts?
I love this question because this is something I've been thinking so much about. And at first I was convinced that yes, there was a difference. And now I'm starting to think that might not be true. I think a part of the reason I think that is over time, their styles evolve. And I think Elizabeth in particular starts with a more amorphous kind of just a fluid style of writing accounts. And then she definitely develops a style that's a little more formalized. I will say the biggest difference overall is formalization, and the fact that Jonathan Corwin especially, but Robert Gibbs as well, are, they're merchants working in a certain, within a community that has certain, formal standards for how you keep accounts. And that bleeds into the way in which they keep even something like a waste book. You can see from those images I showed, it's not the most organized for sure, but there was a style, right? And she does not always follow that. So I will say, like, there are points where she says, they'll include, for example, a notation like per or DD for delivered, and she'll write like to your wife very clearly. And so I think that was one thing that I sensed was different. And then the other cool thing that I think is something particular to Elizabeth, and it could be because she's writing in some of her husband's accounts, but she's very attentive to dates. And this reminds me of something my grandmother always told me to write on like pictures and things, that when we were little, the date, right? You should always include the date. And Jonathan Corwin is all over the place with like how consistent he writes the dates. And in her own book, she is all over the place as well. But in his book, she's incredibly careful about writing the dates. And that seemed to me part of actually the fact that she's writing in someone else's book and that they're working collaboratively. And so he needs to know, specifically what she did on whichever date. And then to that point, on the back of every letter, and this is one of the coolest things I found, she writes, so if she received a letter from her son in July 99, she writes July 99 on the back of that letter. And those are clearly in her hand. And so I really love that, just to see her preserving and kind of archiving herself.
And finally, you provided a key players genealogical chart, which included Robert Gibbs Jr. And I didn't note the date he was born. The question is, was Elizabeth raising him, and were there other children while she was active in business, or did she kind of do this once the children had come of age?
Great question. So I actually did not include the children on the genealogical chart, and I should have, but I'm not the best at making family trees. But okay, so she has technically 4, but one dies young. So, and maybe another one kind of dies young. So she has 2 children, 2 to 3 children. We don't know about the daughter, that come from her Gibbs marriage to Salem with her. And then in the starting in, I believe, 1679, she starts to have children with Jonathan Corwin. And she has children actually very, very late. She has children consistently until she's like 47 or something. She's really old, but almost all of them die. And this is something scholars who write about the witch trials have said, like, might have been bad luck. So because so many of her children die. And what's interesting is she is carrying on she's carrying on business during these years as well. But there's definitely a period in the 1680s when she's actively childbearing, when her accounts, they shift a bit in tone, much more toward kind of care of the family and nursing and things like that she's paying people for. And there's a period in which she becomes less involved, I would argue, in the family's business affairs. And so it's something I'm still thinking about, but it's a really interesting and I think important question.
Great. So we've had a couple of other questions. One includes a woman who's reached out, who's doing research herself and would like to actually connect with you. I would like to invite anyone who has further questions, including Gina, to reach out to us at research@pem.org, and we can facilitate communicating with Caylin or helping to answer your questions as well. And at this point, I'd like to thank everyone and turn the mic back over to Dan.
Thanks, Jen. Caylin, that was fantastic. Really, really interesting. We loved having you as a fellow this year, and we wish you all the best in your career going forward. And we look forward to seeing you back in the library at some point. So again, thanks to Caylin, thanks to Jen for moderating. Thank you again to the Malami family and to all of you for attending this evening. Have a great night, and we'll see you again soon.